is the ontological connection between material possession and an individual's ultimate well-being the very foundation of human happiness, or an external shackle on spiritual autonomy? How should reason discipline the boundaries of human desire? And at what level does consumer behavior shape the authenticity of an individual's existence? This philosophical inquiry, spanning millennia, is not a secondary issue spawned by modern consumer society, but rather a core proposition anchored by both classical Western virtue ethics and contemporary applied consumer ethics. It also constitutes a central category within the ethics of desire regulation that continues to be explored by the international philosophical community. This proposition neither advocates a wholesale rejection of consumer behavior nor promotes extreme asceticism. Rather, it focuses on the normative relationship between material possession, desire-driven behavior, and existential autonomy. It seeks to clarify the essential boundaries between reasonable needs and delusional obsessions, and to explore ethical pathways for individuals to achieve lasting inner peace. Anglo-American analytic philosophy has transformed this proposition into empirical research on the relationship between the satisfaction of individual preferences and ultimate well-being, using data and logic to verify the limited role of material accumulation in fostering happiness. Continental philosophy, on the other hand, explores the risks of alienation that consumer behavior poses to an individual's authentic existence from an ontological perspective, constructing a deep logical framework centered on material detachment and spiritual self-sufficiency. The interweaving of these two mainstream perspectives has liberated this philosophical proposition from superficial, localized, and everyday interpretations, transforming it into a core intellectual link connecting classical ethical wisdom with modern existential dilemmas. It also provides a dimension of reflection, combining academic rigor with practical guidance for examining our daily consumption choices. The ethical currents concerning material possessions and desire in Western classical philosophy do not follow the linear progression often portrayed in popular interpretations. Instead, they exhibit a clearly defined academic lineage characterized by coexistence, mutual complementarity, and modern extensions. This historical framework strictly aligns with the established chronology and school classifications within the international classical philosophy community. During the era of ancient Greek city-states in the 4th century BCE, the Cynic and Epicurean schools emerged simultaneously, each establishing a distinct paradigm for the governance of desire. The Cynics, with material detachment as their core principle, pursued unconditional spiritual self-sufficiency, becoming the earliest intellectual source of Western minimalist ethics. The Epicurean school, on the other hand, constructed a framework of rationally restrained desire, acknowledging the legitimacy of natural needs while resisting the unchecked expansion of obsessive desires, thereby forming an ethical system of moderate hedonism. Subsequently, the Stoics inherited the core ideas of both schools, proposing a view of desire characterized by moderation and balance. This approach avoided the extreme asceticism of the Cynics while rejecting unrestrained indulgence, becoming a harmonious synthesis within the classical tradition of desire regulation and enhancing the practical applicability of classical ethics. Following the rise of German voluntarism in the modern era, Schopenhauer combined classical material criticism with the ontology of the will to live, defining consumption as the external expression of the will's objectification. He focused his critique on inauthentic consumption driven by the need for recognition from others, thereby completing the theoretical transition from classical thought to modern philosophy. It must be clarified that anti-consumerism is a modern conceptual rephrasing. The original core categories of classical philosophy are material detachment and the discipline of desire. This rigorous definition of the intellectual lineage corrects the cognitive biases found in popular texts, which confuse the logic of schools of thought and distort their evolutionary trajectories, and allows us to grasp the authentic essence of classical thought with greater precision. The core theoretical framework of classical ethics regarding the discipline of desire was established by three thinkers recognized internationally as representative figures. Their views all have clear sources in original texts, free from any subjective distortion or conceptual misinterpretation. As a central figure of the Cynic school, Diogenes' ideas are recorded in Diogenes Laertius' lives and opinions of eminent philosophers. His core stance is the rejection of artificial norms and the imposition of values by secular society, practicing spiritual self-sufficiency through extreme material minimalism. This choice is not merely asceticism or self-denial, but a complete detachment from external dependencies such as worldly status and prestige. Within his philosophical system, material dependence is the central shackle binding the freedom of existence. The fewer external material possessions an individual possesses, the lower their dependence on worldly rules, and only then can true autonomy at the level of existence be achieved. In his letter to Monaxis, Epicurus proposed the classic tripartite classification of desires in the history of philosophy, a distinction still employed by scholars today. He strictly distinguishes between natural and necessary desires, natural but non-essential desires, and vain desires. With mental tranquility as the ultimate goal of happiness, he advocates for the satisfaction of natural and necessary desires essential for basic survival, exercising prudence toward natural but non-essential desires that bring pleasure, and resolutely rejecting vain attachments to wealth, fame, and status. Attachments characterized by an insatiable appetite that serves as the root cause of spiritual anxiety. In The Wisdom of Life, Schopenhauer argues from a voluntarist perspective that much of modern society's consumption behavior does not stem from genuine individual needs, but rather from inauthentic choices driven by vanity and the judgment of others. Such behavior places one's self-worth in the eyes of the outside world. Not only does it fail to bring lasting happiness, but it also traps the individual in a cycle of comparison and anxiety. Anglo-American analytic philosophy corroborates the core tenets of these three thinkers from the perspective of preference rationality, while continental existentialism extends them into an ontological dichotomy between authentic existence and mundane decline, collectively enriching the international academic interpretation of this theoretical framework. Classical ethics of desire discipline is not an abstract historical theory, but rather forms a precise, transgenerational academic reflection of the existential dilemmas of modern consumer society. This reflection represents a deep-seated theoretical prediction of the universal human predicament, rather than a simple analogy to reality. Epicurus' critique of the endless nature of vain desires resonates perfectly with modern psychology's theory of hedonic adaptation. As validated by empirical research in Anglo-American analytic philosophy, the pleasure derived from consumption is highly transient. Individuals quickly adapt to new material possessions, thereby generating even greater consumption cravings and falling into a cycle of perpetual dissatisfaction, a phenomenon that aligns perfectly with the essential characteristics of vain desires. The Cynic's critique of material dependence precisely corresponds to the three core issues of modern society: symbolic consumption, consumption driven by status comparison, and impulse buying. Modern individuals' extensive consumption is not driven by the use value of goods, but rather by the pursuit of the status symbols and social group affiliations these goods represent. To conform to societal expectations, they continuously acquire non-essential items, ultimately falling into the dual predicament of material overload and spiritual anxiety. Continental philosophy defines this phenomenon as consumer alienation, that is, the transformation of the individual from a user of material goods into a vassal of materialism, thereby losing autonomy over one's existence. Anglo-American analytic philosophy, through research on preference satisfaction, demonstrates that symbolic consumption fails to enhance an individual's genuine well-being, offering only fleeting psychological gratification. This cross-school, cross-epochal theoretical convergence enables the wisdom of classical philosophy to directly resolve the core dilemmas of modern consumerism and liberate self-identity from the stranglehold of materialism. Within the ethical framework of classical desire regulation lies a core theoretical tension recognized by the international academic community. This tension is not a conflict between schools of thought, but rather a divergence in the paths toward the governance of desire and the realization of happiness, endowing the entire intellectual system with richer logical layers. The core divergence manifests as the opposition between the cynic's ascetic stance of absolute renunciation of material possessions and the Epicurean's moderate hedonistic approach. The cynics advocate for the complete severing of all non-essential material attachments, achieving spiritual freedom through extreme minimalism, and pursuing a state of existence entirely detached from worldly conventions. The Epicureans, however, acknowledge the rationality of natural desires, believing that the moderate satisfaction of basic needs is a prerequisite for achieving peace of mind. They reject both extreme asceticism and unrestrained indulgence. This gives rise to a debate over the ethical boundary between the absolute suppression of desire and the reasonable fulfillment of natural desires, constituting a core theoretical contradiction within classical ethics. Simultaneously, this contradiction extends into an external conflict between classical virtue-based self-sufficiency ethics and modern consumerist value ethics. Classical philosophy asserts that happiness stems from inner spiritual self-sufficiency, while modern consumerism directly links happiness to material possession. The Stoic view of moderation and desire serves as a theoretical reconciliation between the two, opposing both extreme renunciation of material goods and unrestrained expansion of desire, advocating for the rational control of desire so that material possessions serve life rather than dominate it. Anglo-American analytic philosophy interprets this contradiction from the perspective of ethical pluralism, arguing that different paths suit the existential needs of different individuals. Continental philosophy, however, views it as a struggle between authentic existence and secular discipline. The comprehensive presentation of this contradictory system frees us from simplistic, extreme interpretations and allows for a more holistic understanding of the practical value of classical ethics. The intellectual value of classical ethics of desire regulation does not remain confined to historical texts. Rather, it possesses profound contemporary practical significance and has been identified by the international academic community as the core intellectual antidote to modern consumer alienation. Its core value lies in the normative correction of contemporary consumerism, helping individuals reconstruct rational boundaries of desire and a clear understanding of their existence. Through Epicurus's tripartite classification of desire, individuals can clearly distinguish genuine needs from illusory obsessions, freeing themselves from the hijacking of self-identity by symbolic consumption and ceasing to equate material possession with self-worth. Drawing on the cynic's doctrine of material indifference, individuals can reduce their existential dependence on external material possessions and worldly evaluations, thereby minimizing the time, energy, and financial burdens of non-essential consumption and enhancing their autonomy at the existential level. Anglo-American analytic philosophy has transformed this classical thought into the modern consumer ethic of sufficiency, advocating that material satisfaction be centered on enough rather than infinite accumulation. This principle has been validated by empirical research as effectively enhancing individuals' long-term well-being. Continental existentialism, meanwhile, has elevated it into a practical path toward authentic existence. urging individuals to break free from the shackles of secular consumerist conditioning, make choices based on genuine needs, and achieve existential autonomy and freedom. This philosophy does not advocate extreme asceticism, but rather emphasizes the rational control of desire, ensuring that consumption serves happiness itself rather than becoming an obstacle to it. This extension of values, which combines classical heritage with modern academic rigor, is fully aligned with the practical needs of contemporary individuals. In contemporary society, consumerism has permeated every dimension of daily life. Commercial advertising, social contexts, and secular values constantly reinforce the notion that material possession equals happiness, causing individuals to unwittingly fall into a cycle of alienation driven by desire. Individuals purchase goods beyond their needs in pursuit of secular validation, engage in meaningless consumption rivalries to conform to group aesthetics, and make impulsive purchasing decisions to satisfy fleeting psychological pleasure. They devote vast amounts of time and energy to these pursuits, even incurring debt, yet remain unable to attain lasting happiness. The essence of this state is the loss of existential authenticity as defined by continental philosophy. Individuals no longer make choices based on their genuine needs, but are instead dominated by secular consumerist conditioning and illusory desires, transforming from the masters of their lives into vassals of material possessions and the gaze of others. Empirical data from Anglo-American analytic philosophy shows that once an individual's material possessions exceed basic survival needs, increased wealth and consumption no longer correlate positively with greater happiness. Instead, they exacerbate mental anxiety and existential confusion. This conclusion aligns perfectly with the core tenets of classical philosophy and confirms that the root cause of the modern consumer dilemma lies not in material scarcity, but in the disorder of desire and the alienation of existence. Practicing the classical ethics of desire discipline does not require individuals to emulate the extreme minimalist lifestyle of the Cynics, but rather to establish a logical framework for governing desire centered on reason, a principle recognized as a standard of practice within the international philosophical community. Individuals need not renounce all material pleasures. They need only engage in a rational analysis of the hierarchy of desires before each consumption choice, discerning whether that choice stems from natural necessities, natural non-necessities, or delusional obsessions. For natural necessities, one should satisfy them openly, as this is the prerequisite for sustaining life and basic well-being. For natural non-necessities, one should satisfy them moderately while upholding the principle of prudence, without indulgence or attachment, to prevent them from becoming a mental burden. As for delusional obsessions regarding wealth, fame, and identity, one must resolutely reject them, recognizing their inherently insatiable nature and freeing oneself from their domination over one's choices. This practical path is not merely a mundane exhortation within a local context, but rather a rational discipline of desire grounded in classical ethics. It helps individuals simplify the burdens of life, redirecting their energy from non-essential consumption toward dimensions that bring lasting well-being, such as intellectual enrichment, emotional connection, and spiritual growth. Anglo-American analytic philosophy defines this process as rational preference screening, while continental philosophy refers to it as the return to authentic existence. Together, these two perspectives provide a dual foundation at the practical level. When defining the essence of happiness from a philosophical perspective, one finds that all mainstream schools of thought point to the same core. Happiness is an internal mental state, not an external material possession. Aristotle defined happiness as a well-rounded human life, a state of fulfillment grounded in virtue and reason, with no essential connection to external material conditions. Epicurus defined happiness as peace of mind, a state arising from the rational control of desires rather than material abundance. Schopenhauer defined happiness as the tranquility of the will, a tranquility stemming from liberation from the constraints of worldly judgments and a return to one's authentic self. From the perspective of welfare theory, Anglo-American analytic philosophy demonstrates that inner spiritual self-sufficiency contributes far more to a sense of happiness than external material possessions. Continental philosophy, from an ontological perspective, points out that true happiness lies in the realization of one's authentic being, rather than the fulfillment of worldly values. The illusion of material possessions equaling happiness, fostered by modern consumerism, is, at its core, a distortion of the essence of happiness. This illusion drives individuals to endlessly pursue external material possessions while neglecting their inner, genuine needs, ultimately leading them to existential confusion in the pursuit. The wisdom of classical philosophy serves as the key to shattering this illusion, enabling individuals to return to a fundamental understanding of happiness. When individuals use reason to discipline their desires and free themselves from the shackles of consumerism, they gradually achieve true freedom at the level of existence. This freedom is not unrestrained indulgence, but the realization of existential autonomy. No longer bound by the possession of non-essential material goods, individuals need not expend extra energy maintaining material symbols. They are no longer consumed by anxiety stemming from worldly expectations. Instead, they can choose a lifestyle based on their genuine needs, investing their time and energy in pursuits that foster personal growth and spiritual fulfillment. This state embodies the spiritual self-sufficiency sought by classical philosophy, the authentic existence advocated by continental existentialism, and what Anglo-American analytic philosophy defines as a state of high autonomy and well-being. Empirical research confirms that individuals in this state exhibit lower anxiety levels and higher life satisfaction. The core of material minimalism is not about having nothing, but about freeing oneself from dependence on material possessions. The core of desire restraint is not about asceticism, but about refusing to be dominated by delusional obsessions. This fundamental understanding frees the practice of classical ethics from extreme misinterpretations, transforming it into a wisdom for living that is applicable to all individuals. Consumption itself has never been ethically controversial. Reasonable consumption is a fundamental guarantee of human survival and a normal behavior that satisfies natural necessities. Classical philosophy has never denied the value of reasonable consumption. Its criticism centers on irrational consumption driven by delusional desires, the cognitive bias that equates material possession with self-worth, and inauthentic consumption choices hijacked by secular norms. The international philosophical community defines reasonable consumption as instrumental behavior serving well-being and irrational consumption as an expression of alienated existence. The core distinction between the two lies in whether the individual is the master of consumption or is dominated by it. Anglo-American analytic philosophy emphasizes the functional value of consumption from the perspective of instrumental rationality, while continental philosophy cautions against the risks of alienation in consumption from the perspective of existential rationality. Together, these two perspectives clearly delineate the ethical boundaries of consumption. Consumption should serve life and happiness, rather than become an obstacle to happiness. This definition of boundaries frees us from the extreme mindset of either hedonism or asceticism, and establishes a rational, moderate understanding of consumption. Classical philosophy's ethical reflections on desire and material possessions, spanning over 2 millennia, continue to offer core guidance for modern individuals. The fundamental reason lies in the fact that it addresses humanity's eternal existential questions: how to find balance between the external world and the inner self, how to maintain boundaries between desire-driven impulses and rational control, and how to realize one's true nature amidst secular norms and existential autonomy. No matter how times change or how abundant material goods become, humanity's pursuit of lasting happiness and true freedom has never wavered. The wisdom of classical philosophy offers the most essential answer to this quest. The fewer possessions one has, the lighter the burden of existence. The simpler one's desires, the greater the inner peace, and the more independent one's self-identity, the more complete one's existential freedom. In today's modern society of extreme material abundance, this wisdom holds greater practical significance than ever before. It helps us pierce the fog of consumerism, clarify the boundary between genuine needs and obsessive desires, and return to the authentic state of life. We need not deliberately pursue an extreme minimalist lifestyle, nor must we renounce all material comforts. We need only maintain a rational clarity in every choice, uphold the boundaries of our awareness when desires arise, and preserve our independence amidst worldly comparisons. Exercising rational control over desire does not mean suppressing the self, but rather freeing the self from the shackles of delusional attachments. Simplifying material possessions does not mean living in poverty, but rather freeing life from unnecessary burdens. This rationality and clarity allow us to preserve inner peace, achieve autonomy in our existence, and attain lasting happiness that truly belongs to us amidst the complexities of modern society. From the classical philosophical ethics of desire regulation to academic discussions on modern consumer ethics, from the existential practices of ancient Greek thinkers to the daily choices of contemporary individuals, the core proposition remains unchanged. An individual's happiness and freedom are never defined by external material possessions, but are sustained by inner spiritual fulfillment. Modern consumer society creates too many illusions and obsessions, yet the wisdom of classical philosophy consistently reminds us to return to the essence, to return to reason, and to return to our authentic selves. For every individual caught in the tide of consumerism, putting this wisdom into practice is never an overnight transformation, but rather a continuous process of rational awareness and choice. Every decision to reject frivolous consumption is a steadfast commitment to existential autonomy. Every attempt to simplify life's burdens is a step towards spiritual freedom. Every act of detaching from external judgments is an affirmation of self-worth. The empirical conclusions of Anglo-American analytic philosophy and the existential reflections of continental philosophy both confirm the same truth. True happiness stems from inner contentment. True freedom stems from the rational control of desire. And the true self stems from an authentic existence free from worldly conditioning. In this era enveloped by consumption and desire, may we all draw strength from the ethical wisdom of classical philosophy, break free from the traps of materialism and obsession, clarify the boundary between genuine needs and illusions, control desire with reason, safeguard freedom through minimalism, and define happiness through authenticity. There is no need to pander to worldly expectations, no need to chase meaningless comparisons, and no need to be held hostage by alienating consumption. We need only live according to our true needs, preserve our inner peace and independence, and live out our authentic selves. This is both the eternal insight classical philosophy has bequeathed to modern humanity and the core path for every individual to achieve happiness and freedom.